All right, welcome to another study in Second Peter. We're going to be looking at Second Peter chapter 2 today, and that is about false teachers and their destruction. Let's look first of all at the first two verses of Second Peter chapter 2. In contrast to the prophets, uh, false prophets were also present in the Old Testament. And in the same way as false teachers will arise among us as believers, and that's what Peter is warning about. They're going to introduce destructive heresies and deny Jesus who bought them. If you're a little bit more reformed leaning and uh, you understand about eternal security, uh, it can also mean that Jesus who died for them, Jesus died for all of us. And so this is not necessarily saying that these people were believers, but they are denying Jesus the Lord who died for everyone, and that many will follow uh, their shameful ways, and in doing that will bring the truth into disrepute. If we look at verses 3 to 5, we see that greed will motivate them, and they will be motivated to exploit them. And in contrast to what the apostles have been doing, they will make up stories rather than being eyewitnesses. Their condemnation is coming, and Peter uses the Old Testament to demonstrate how God will judge them, just as he judged the angels. The fallen angels in Genesis chapter 6 is what we're assuming. Jude is very similar here, and it appears to be quoting an apocryphal book um, that is First Enoch, verses 1, verse 9. So, um, as we continue to look at Second Peter and we come to verse 6, we see that, sorry, I just having a bit of technical difficulty here. We see that another Old Testament example is that God brought the flood on the ungodly, but he spared Noah. And finally, as an Old Testament example, he looks at Sodom and Gomorrah, where once again he brought judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, but spared Lot, the righteous person. So the point is that God knows how to rescue the godly and hold the unrighteous for judgment. And that's especially true for those uh, with corrupt desire and who despise authority. As we continue in looking at verse 10 now in Second Peter chapter 2, we see that these false teachers are slandering celestial beings. And this is in contrast that not even angels do this. And once again, we're seeing um, what is believed to be a lost apocryphal book known to the church fathers as the Assumption of Moses. And it's also quoted in Jude, where the angel is mentioned, and it's the archangel Michael, and he would not um, condemn Satan, even though he was fighting over the body of Moses. This is kind of a Peter's using this as an example of how the mocking and the uh, speaking against celestial beings, even though they're evil, um, is is very unwise, and they're acting like brute beasts who have no respect for authority. I think also it's safe to assume that he's talking about the authority of the church, of course, because the apostles are claiming one version of the story, and these new false teachers are trying to introduce another one. So I think that's there as well. Um, they claim to have special knowledge, but really they're likened to brute beasts. And they will be paid back harm for what they have done. And literally it says harm for harm. And this theme of being paid back and getting a wage for doing wrong, um, it, Peter's going to weave that throughout this discussion. Talks about carousing in broad daylight, and emphasizing here that these people, these false teachers, have no shame. They're openly greedy and adulterous in the fellowship, in the church itself. So these are some characteristics of these false teachers. We look at verse uh, 15 and 16. Here's where it becomes quite clear what Peter is talking about. And he talks about the way of Balaam. And what characterized Balaam was false prophecy, greed, and lust. So he wanted to make money more than he wanted to speak the truth. He hurt God's people when he could not curse them. He told Balak how to have them fall, and that was through idolatry and lust. So he couldn't curse them directly, but he told Balak how to lead them away from blessing, and that was through um, sexual immorality and causing them to worship their gods rather than the one true God. The other thing we see about Balaam is he was rebuked by a donkey. And here, once again, we have a senseless beast in the passage. And this time, we're shown that the beast was wiser than the false prophet Balaam, because he restrained the prophet from going to see Balak. Now, remember, God had initially told him not to. Then, when he persisted, God said, "Okay, go to him." And then on the way, an angel was ready to slay him, and the donkey, Balaam's donkey, protected him, and eventually spoke and said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Obviously, a miraculous intervention on God's part, and just showed how foolish the false prophet was. In verses 17 to 20, as we conclude the chapter here, these false prophets are likened to springs without water, clouds without rain, or in Peter. Again, we see that this is in Jude as well. And in Jude, it says clouds without rain. In Peter here, we see it's a reference to mist blown along by the storm. I think the same idea is meant. And finally, mouths that speak empty words. So there's a promise of life, there's a promise of water, of something good, but it's empty. And the characteristic of this particular group that Peter is writing about is that they appeal to lustful desires, and they try to entice new converts, those who are just escaping from idolatry. They promise freedom, but are in bondage to sin. They claim and they make boasts that they are free, whereas the true church isn't. But in reality, it's the other way around. Um, so yeah. Also, finally, he says that if they knew the Lord, but if they got entangled again in sin, they'd be worse off than before. And so I think Peter here is saying these prophets, these false teachers that had arisen among the church and were going to continue to cause problems with the church, they were teaching some version of Gnosticism. That's kind of a basic belief of most commentators, and they're saying that what they held to was the fact that they had special knowledge, and this special knowledge was very much influenced by Greek mystery cults and Greek philosophy, Platonism in particular, that saw evil, the physical world, as evil. And so there was two different strains that developed. One was the body was evil, so it needed to be suppressed, and the other was the body was evil, and it wasn't going to survive, so it didn't matter what you did in the body. And this latter form of Gnosticism is what seems to have taken hold. in and around the church that Peter is writing to. And he's warning about it very strongly, that they are entangled in sin. And so that's where the significance comes from, where these people are just coming to know the Lord, and then these false prophets are coming and saying, hey, you don't have to give up all of that idolatry that you were indulging in when you worshiped idols. It's okay, because what we do in the body doesn't matter. But Peter is stating once again that immorality is not freedom, but actually the very bondage that they were being delivered from. And so he closes with two very powerful um, proverbs. One is from the Bible, and it's just like a dog returns to its vomit. And the second is one that was probably popular as well, and just as a pig returns to the mud after it's been washed. So in both cases, we see the animal, again, we have the brute beast being compared to the false prophets and false teachers. But this time we see them. So the dog gets sick and he returns and eats it, or the pig is washed and yet the pig returns to its mud. And so in both cases, we see just a picture of what Peter's trying to demonstrate to them, that returning to the former sexual immorality, even if it is not directly connected with idols, is still bondage, and it's still part of the sinful nature that is meant to die as we are believers. So that is 2 Peter chapter 2, and we see that the theme has been false prophets and their ultimate demise.